Welcome, everyone. I'm Catherine Lavender, the Data Project Manager for NACDA, and this is our NACDA Data on Aging podcast series. NACDA is the National Archive of Computerized Data on Aging at ICPSR at the University of Michigan, and we're funded by the National Institute on Aging. Our mission is to advance research on aging by helping researchers to share and discover a broad range of data sets for secondary analysis. We acquire and preserve data relevant to gerontological research, kind of like a data library, curating the data as needed to promote effective research use, and then we share the data with the research community free of charge. By preserving and making available the largest library of electronic data on aging in the United States, we offer opportunities for secondary analysis on major issues of scientific and policy relevance. The focus of this podcast series is to connect with the gerontological research community. We will highlight data resources, researchers, and principal investigators in order to talk through data concerns, as well as learn the stories behind the projects. You can find out more about NACDA and ICPSR by visiting nacda-aging.org. Today, our guest is Dr. Kenneth Ferraro, Distinguished Professor of Sociology and Director of the Center on Aging and the Life Course at Purdue University, as well as our Director of NACDA, Dr. James McNally. I'm going to hand it over to Dr. McNally and go ahead and start chatting.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure to have Dr. Ferraro on the podcast. He was one of the instrumental scientists behind NACDA and has had an influence on everything we've done. In fact, he interviewed me for the job of director some 20 plus years ago when he was our resident scientist. And we got the pleasure of working with him for 4 years as he helped set the scientific agenda that made NACDA what it is today. Currently, however, Dr. Ferraro uses a life course framework to examine health inequality, especially racial and ethnic disparities, and the cumulative effects of early exposure to adult health. So, Ken, it's wonderful to have you here. How did you get involved in researching health inequalities?
Thank you, Jim, for the opportunity to visit with you today and for that gracious introduction. I got started in the research on health inequality from a sociological framework. I was trained as a sociologist, and sociologists tend to be interested in stratification and its many different facets, but especially socioeconomic status and race. And I saw that most sociologists were doing research related to outcomes such as income, wealth, power, those sorts of things. But I was really intrigued by the sense of health as a resource. And it's really a powerful resource. We've learned that from other studies. And so it began this inquiry of, well, how is it that health problems emerge over the factors that can help people with health problems to maintain their independence and experience what we call optimal aging. So it was really a fusion of research on stratification with research on the life course and fusing those two together to think about inequalities in health.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I mean, your connection with life course research has really been fascinating to watch through your publications and also through the many students who are now faculty at prestigious universities that you've taught over the years. It's one of the pleasures to see the Ferraro effect in their research. When you started this work, what were some of the data sets that you used in your research program on health inequality? And why did you pick those specific data sets?
That's a great question. I've used a number of data sets over the years, and I think one of the most powerful ones was back in the 90s, I opened up the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey. And NHANES, as we like to call it, is mostly a cross-sectional series of studies funded by the federal government. As the name implies, it has lots of information on health and nutrition, as well as physical activity, et cetera. I found one series of the NHANES, which actually had a longitudinal follow-up. And this really intrigued me as someone who studies aging to have longitudinal data. So what we had was people that were first interviewed and underwent a physical examination in 1970s, and they were followed for 20 years. And as a sociologist, I was very intrigued by the racial disparities that we saw in health. And that analysis helped me to get started in this program. From there, I also used the Americans Changing Lives, the MIDAS, the Midlife in the US, the NSHAP, National Social Life, Health and Aging Project, and most recently the HRS, or the Health and Retirement Study. And you can see a pattern in some of those studies where I was looking for a data set that would have an oversample of Black and Hispanic Americans because I was really interested in racial disparities. So that was one of the reasons why I selected those data sets. Although the NHANES didn't have an oversample, it was such a large sample, I had significant numbers of African Americans in that data set. And so that opportunity to examine racial disparities over those years proved really an exciting genre research. And I think, it reflects back too on even before I started the research on health inequality, I've been a user of data sets from ICPSR and from NACDA for decades. And it's a great opportunity to access data for emerging scholars and for those who are members of ICPSR at member institutions of ICPSR. So it really is a way in which I think it enables people from a variety of fields, various levels of their professional development to access data. And I'm really grateful for those data resources.
Okay, well, it's really our mission, and we appreciate you encouraging, both in your own research and through your teaching, the use of these data. What would you consider some of your major findings over the
Well,
years?
I think over the years we've known that there are important disparities between Black and white Americans. I think some of my earliest research on health disparities showed that the sources and the timing of these health disparities is important. So I think a lot of folks studying disparities in later life oftentimes presume that, well, these disparities appear, they emerge in later life. And what we've showed is a lot of those, shall we say, racial gaps in health occur much earlier. We were intrigued in that sense in terms of the isolating those disparities, but then also, again, I've talked about a little bit about longitudinal data, all those data sets that I've mentioned. And so I'm really intrigued by the health dynamics. So when these disparities emerge and then tracking people over time. And some of the things that we've learned from those inquiries is that it's not just a question of skin color or one's racial or ethnic identity, but it's about the lived experiences, right? So people have very different lifestyles and exposures across the life course. And what we find is that early insults, things such as poverty during childhood or being raised in a dysfunctional family, a family that's perhaps beset by problems such as we would think of as substance abuse or physical abuse of children. Kids raised in those families, I mean, they develop health problems much earlier and much more severe health problems than young people that are not raised that way. So, I was studying gerontology, and then I was just amazed by how much the life course imprints the health processes and how we need to think of the early origins of these health disparities that we see in later life.
this is fascinating, and it all seems to tie into some of your current work that looks at cumulative inequality and accumulation. And are there differences between those two topics? I mean, even your 1918 or 2018 article in the journals has been heavily cited on, sort of defining accumulation. So if you could talk a little bit about those topics, that would be great.
Thank you. So I guess it starts with an inquiry about reflecting on the findings that one accumulates. You start out in your career and you're very eager to make contributions to the literature. After you do that a number of times, you start wondering, well, how do all the pieces of the puzzle make sense? And our rapid, increase in the dissemination of scientific findings. I mean, it's just the literatures on these topics are just so substantial and rapidly evolving. So I guess there's that sense of me that although I continue to make individual contributions, specific projects and journal articles, I've also felt in the last 15 years or so that I want to do more to integrate those findings or to synthesize some of the principles that we see in all of these studies or in many of these studies. So that's just sort of a reflective approach, I guess I would take in thinking about science. And science itself really is based upon this development of a stock of knowledge. And so what I was trying to do was take stock. What do we know about health dynamics, and how does social stratification, play a role in that? How does this unfold over the life course? And I had real delight to work with a few of my graduate students back in about maybe 18 years ago, where we started trying to assemble some information about how accumulation processes work across the life course. And gerontologists are famous for using the word accumulation. we use it regardless of whether we're talking about cognitive reserve or health risks or oxidative stress. Accumulation is just a very common concept in gerontology. And what we've thought is we need to do more to delineate what we mean by accumulation and how it occurs. So that set me on a journey of trying to specify in some axioms and propositions what we call cumulative inequality theory. Working with my students, I also admit to being heavily influenced by Matilda Riley and her theory of age stratification, because I saw in Matilda's work this opportunity to sort of merge these life course processes with social change and how we could think of how these disparities unfold over time in a society.
Yeah, it's your work has evolved in such a fascinating manner. I mean, you've touched on so many health topics, but you've always brought that sociological focus to it that is not. It's a unique perspective you bring out to a lot of the research you report on, and you have an extensive number of collaborators you've worked with, students who you've trained and who have moved on to successful careers. And you're an interesting blend, to my mind, just having known you for 20 plus years and respected you tremendously. You're a very detailed and very precise scientist, but at heart you're also a teacher, and it always seems a joyful experience to talk to your students and your past students and to share memories of how you've guided their science. Earlier, you did discuss some of the data sets you used in your collections, and taking advantage of you now, what advice would you give to other researchers interested in analyzing the NHANES or emerging studies that you're aware of that might add to our understanding of this process?
That's an excellent question, Jim, and it prompts me to think about what you get out of opening up these data sets. So I think those of us who do non-experimental research, we're really attracted to data sets because of maybe the sampling frame and the measures that are included. And so that's very, very important, is trying to be able to get a sense of what is actually the content of these surveys and know something about them. And again, that's one of the beautiful things about NACDA and ICPSR, is that very conveniently you've organized information on all these data sets so that we can, in essence, shop them, get a sense of what's there. Being able to look up the code books before ever even touch the data is a wonderful thing, because then you can see if you actually have the measures that you think might be in that data set. So I'd say first off is there is a period of shopping or comparison of data sets to decide which might be the best one for your purposes. So don't rush that process, right? Take some time and think about what you'd get out of various data sets. And then also think about how much time it's going to take you to prepare them. So, 20, 30 years ago, that was a lot harder. Nowadays, with what NACDA's done by providing code and Stata and SAS and what have you, it's so much easier now. But, there's this cost benefit ratio, what you're going to be able to get out of these data sets, but how much work you're going to have to put in to cultivate them.
Yep.
So, I think that's really important to do that judgment early on. And I guess the bottom line is I probably wouldn't advise a young person, junior scholar, to open a data set for what you might think of as one paper.
Right.
Maybe there's a paper for which you would just open up a data set because you think this is just such an important thing, and you want to answer that research question. That's good. But, in terms of the time allocated to developing a data set, maybe there's some value in thinking of a series of projects in a given data set. I've mentioned a number of data sets, but that unfolded over many years. And so it's hard to manage 3 data sets at the same time. Some people are adept at doing that, but others of us prefer to work in 1 or maybe 2 data sets at a time so that we can compare and contrast findings. So I tend to think of, the time investment you're going to have to make into these data sets versus the return, right? And find that sweet spot that's right for you in your stage of development.
Mhm. Yep. Are there any meetings or research groups or, organizations you generally recommend for people who want to learn about data and learn about how to develop a research career?
So that's clearly the subject of mentoring. So here at Purdue, we have, I usually do one-on-one meetings with my students, and I also do group meetings. And I think that sort of blend of meetings locally is really important. And the Gerontological Society of America provides all sorts of mentoring opportunities, but those tend to be, pretty informal at a kind of high level. I think the best mentors really help you do your work and empower you to do your work. They apprentice you through, the challenges of, well, here's a research question or a hypothesis, and well, we don't find it manifest in the data. Well, now what? Now what do you do? How do you respond to that? So I think, the whole notion of mentoring is such a powerful thing. And I've been fortunate to have some great mentors myself. And I borrowed things from them over the years to try to implement with my students. And then, just the resources that are available now are tremendous. We regularly send students to various workshops, not only at the University of Michigan, but at other venues for summer workshops.
Mm-hmm.
Very, very important. It's great to sit with fellow users of the same data set and learn tricks. And I think people in gerontology anyhow, they tend to be pretty generative and they share what they know with others, which is a really, supportive kind of environment.
That's nice. That's nice. A final question before we wrap this up. We've both been at this business for quite a long time. And one of my mentors, Jacob Siegel, an eminent demographer who passed away last year, he always told me that your research career is defined by things you have to do, and then later on, it's defined by things you want to do. And that's sort of the question. Based on your, extensive publication history, your teaching, you're still excited about science. And what particularly are you excited about for the next decade of work?
That's a wonderful question, and I have to appreciate Professor Siegel's turn of phrase there about basically greater freedom to study what you want to. And I guess what's exciting to me is just learning new things. Most of us have to learn new things for our jobs in one way, shape, or another. But the academic life or the life of a researcher and investigator is so special. I feel so fortunate to be a researcher and to be able to learn new methods and new ideas and new theories, and to work with graduate students testing those theories and methods. That's just really exciting. And then to see graduate students, as you've very graciously described, Jim, to see them establish their research careers is just, a wonderful thing. It's not always a pleasant thing, but sometimes I have to admit that I get excited about surprising findings. Some findings are sort of expected and you are confirming a hypothesis, and other times maybe you don't find what you sought to uncover. And so that's really an intriguing part of the academic life that also excites us. Why is that the case? And how am I going to regroup or perhaps fashion new ideas out of it? So sometimes surprises are most powerful in terms of the training process for students and as well as keeping one interested in the topic.
That's great. If I may, this is a topic that's come up several times in meetings. I had a fascinating discussion with some psychologists in Japan back in March about the effects of COVID on social processes. And basically, we were talking about the need to re-socialize ourselves, to re-enter society, to re-enter teaching, to re-enter being a student. How do you feel about that?
Well, I'm eager to re-enter. As a sociologist, I think you can anticipate that we have a proclivity for wanting to associate with others. And I appreciate what we had to do, during this period of time. And I'm grateful for the technologies that enabled us to carry on. But I still covet those meaningful relationships working in the office or in laboratory settings to be able to restart things. So I agree that it's an important part of our human development to interact with others in face-to-face encounters, etc. And I'm glad that we're able to do that. I'm glad that we're able to have used Zoom and various technologies to get us through that period. But I think that we learn more in group settings.
That's great. Well, we certainly hope to see you at GSA this year if everything goes well, and things seem to be improving. And I want to thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us and to share and to give us your perspective on your research and the future. It's always wonderful to talk with you.
Thank you, Jim and Catherine. It's been a treasure for me to spend time with you over the years, and wish you the best. Thank you so much for what you're doing for the research community through NACDA and ICPSR. Good day.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ken, and thank you, Jim, and thanks to our listeners for joining us on this podcast. You can find links to studies we referenced and other resources by viewing the description accompanying this audio. If you have questions or ideas, please email us at icpsr-nacda@umich.edu.